All right, it is 9 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and start. Lisa, are you ready?
I am. Hopefully this works.
I'm sure it will. Our hour this morning is Dr. Lisa Baxter. She's our Extension Forage Agronomist. And she's going to be speaking today about forage stockpiling and fall prep. So, Lisa, I'm just going to turn it right over to you.
All right, so can you see a screen that looks like a PowerPoint?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have 3 different screens in here, and so that's why I always have to make sure I pick the right one. All right, so do you see presenter view or the actual PowerPoint?
Should be the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I saw the present. It looks like the presenter view to me.
Is it? Okay.
I saw the PowerPoint on the first one.
All right, let me share the other screen then. Is that better?
That's it.
There you go.
Okay. Technology on a Monday. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple different winter grazing options. Well, we can if it'll advance. There we go. All right, so there's 3 options we have for extending winter grazing. The first one's crop residues, and we're going to touch on that one briefly because it's not the biggest option we have here in Georgia. The second one is stockpiled forage, and then the third one is a different winter grazing those winter annual forages. So starting out with those grazing the crop residues, they're an inexpensive feed source. So often, we're just trying to take advantage of something that would be wasted out there in the field. They're good for filling in gaps. So if you have a week or 2 where your winter annuals aren't quite ready, that's where we see these fitting in. The number one thing, if somebody comes to me and asks about grazing these crop residues is we want to see what pesticides were sprayed on that crop. So just because it was safe, when you were harvesting the grain off that crop, doesn't mean that the leaves are necessarily safe. And so we want to double check all of those labels before we turn those cows out on there. So if we're talking about corn residue, we can hold a cow per acre for about 60 to 100 days. And that depends on how well we manage that grazing, how big that cow is, how much residue is actually out there to begin with. There's a lot of factors, and so that's why there's a big range on there. Cotton residue, same, but for about 30 to 35 days with cotton. So as a general rule, we need about 2,000 pounds of residue to hold a cow for about 30 days. So one of the better options we would have is stockpiling, and sometimes it's just called deferred grazing. And this is where we let that forage grow up and accumulate, but we don't graze it until we need it in early winter. So instead of putting out a hay bale each day for the cattle, we would just move that fence and feed them that essentially standing hay. So when we look at kind of the tall fescue yield distribution throughout the season, and this is probably a little narrower than it should be, this is if we have that normal growth. If we just let the fescue grow, kept cows out there on it, this is what we would expect. But if we pulled them off kind of late August, early September, and let that forage grow, then we're going to shift what growth we would have had kind of early fall into that late winter. So we can take advantage of it then when we would normally be feeding hay. Similarly with Bermuda grass, it's a little different shape because Bermuda grass is a warm season forage, so we get all of our growth here at once in the summer. If we did something similar with that, we would just push that yield on down into December. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the grass is growing that long. It means that we're taking what growth was here and moving it, later in the year. So instead of cutting hay and feeding that hay, then we're just keeping the cattle off of that until we're ready to feed it. So stockpiling forage does take some strategy. So we want to graze or take a hay cutting and cut it down to about 3 inches For tall fescue, we want to do that kind of early to mid-September. Y'all may want to go a little earlier if you're up there in North Georgia. With Bermuda grass, we want about 6 to 8 weeks prior to the first anticipated frost. I'm told this year that it's supposed to be a more mild winter, and so that could be a lot later than normal. I was also told it was supposed to be an above average rainfall year. We see how that's worked out for a lot of us in South Georgia. 2, we want to add fertilizer like we were making a hay cutting. And so with tall fescue, we can put out about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And with Bermuda grass, we can do about 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre because it's more responsive, especially there in late summer. 3, this is the critical part. We can't allow it to be grazed until we need it. Or we're not really taking advantage of the stockpile. So with tall fescue, it would be after Thanksgiving, and then Bermuda grass after that first killing frost. So this is some data that I pulled from Dennis and has the expected output from the stockpile. You can see the yield is greater with the Bermuda grass, and that's just because we're capturing more of that yield coming off of its peak growing season. So if we tried to stockpile that fescue earlier in the year, those numbers would be a lot higher. We get about the same number of grazing days off of each of those. The fescue is usually more digestible than the Bermuda grass. Protein and the TDN is going to be about the same. Depending on how or what those final nutrients are, depending on how quickly we graze them, how well we graze down that stockpile. And also the fertility of that field before it entered that stockpile phase. So there's a lot of factors that go into there, but it's pretty good nutrition, especially, when you compare it to just feeding dry hay. So like I said, the results are highly dependent. This year, they're going to be very highly dependent on rainfall. So the stockpile idea is good, but we still have to have that rainfall to keep the grass growing and give us that forage accumulation going into winter. So by far, one of the biggest advantages we have in the Southeast is cool season annuals. That's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. And then this is probably where we'll have the most questions at the end too. So if we look at fall average daily gain across these different forage mixtures here, so we have just ryegrass, and then small grains like oats, rye, triticale, and wheat mixed with that ryegrass. We're seeing some pretty good gains off of them in the fall, but mostly here in the spring. We really see the greatest gains overall here with this ryegrass mixture. When we look at the gains in terms of pounds per acre, we see a lot more out of that ryegrass mixture again. As a result, the cost per gain is usually on the cheaper end for that mixture. And then if you add all that together, we see the greatest returns. A lot of that is because rye and ryegrass grow at very different times during the year. And so we're really maximizing the number of days that we can keep cattle out there grazing. The more we can keep them grazing and the less we have to feed them hay, the higher this net return number is going to be. So like I said, winter annuals, they're one of our biggest advantages that we have in the Southeast. They do require more input than stockpile or crop residues because we do have to go in and plant them. They are annuals after all. But we're going to see much bigger outputs, especially if we're looking at cattle gains from these winter annuals than the stockpile or the crop residues. So step one for going into plant a winter annual is we have to not only submit the soil sample, but we have to encourage producers to follow the soil test recommendations. I tell people taking the soil sample is great, but if we don't actually, pull it off the dashboard of our truck and follow what's on there, it's not going to do us any good. And so I've, talking to several agents, I can help you walk through this, but at the bottom of the soil test report, it says exactly what we need to put out there. What I have ran into, we'll submit a form for rye, and then the producer will say, well, actually, I think I want to plant oats instead. If we have these test values here, so that soil test index value, we can look on the Few Lab website, and they have a PDF for how to convert those for each into recommendations for each of the different crops. And so we don't have to send in a different soil test, for each crop or ask for a different report for each crop. Once we have those index values once, we can pull different recommendations for those. The biggest thing that I see related to the soil test and following that is, especially if we're going to plant a legume, is making sure we're in that optimum soil pH range. And so in the winter, that's where most of our Georgia producers are going to be including a legume into their pastures or hay fields. And that's because crimson clover is one of the easiest things that we have to grow. But we got to make sure the pH is optimum. So if they are looking at, putting in alfalfa, we've got to have that up 6.5 to 7. Red clover that we're doing some work with here in South Georgia is a little more tolerant, but we still got to be over 6 to get that red clover to grow. White clover that you'll see more up in North Georgia is more tolerant to those acidic soils, but the closer we can get it to that 6 or above, the more productive that clover is going to be. Perennial peanut that we can grow here in South Georgia, it's on the lower end, so it's Sericea lespedeza. But then our annual clovers, they're quite tolerant of those more acidic soils, so we start dipping below 6. But again, we really need to be 6 or above to really maximize the production of those annual clovers. So the second thing is we've got to prepare the seed bed. That means plowing or disking 2 to 4 weeks prior to planting, getting that lime and fertilizer in place. With a lot of lime, it's going to take a good 6 months for us to see the effect of that lime. So if that pH is down, 4, 4, 5, there's no sense in planting clovers this year. We need to wait for that pH to come up. Put in a pre-plant herbicide, keeping in mind, what we're planting and making sure it's not going to have residual against those seeds. And we want to allow that soil time to settle, or either go in and firm it down with a cultipacker or a roller. So the good rule of thumb is if you walk across it with your boots, it should be no more than about 1/4 of an inch deep. So you should see a defined boot print. But if you're sinking down in that soil, you need to go back and roll it again. If you can't get your boot to show any print at all, that means it's too firm, and we need to go back and start again. A lot of producers are going to want to overseed, especially on their hay fields. They don't want to go in and disc it up like this. And so yield is generally less with overseeding, but it allows us to extend that grazing onto the perennial pastures or hay fields. So, yes, the yield will be lower if we don't put it into a prepared seed bed, but we're utilizing something that would otherwise just be setting dormant all winter. Next, choose an adapted variety. And mixtures are excellent options, but we have to remember the yield is not additive. And so if we plant rye and ryegrass together, we don't get the 6,000 pounds of rye yield and the 12,000 pounds of ryegrass yield. We're going to get there somewhere around kind of the 8,000 to 9,000 mark with those. The distribution and how or when they grow during the winter is wide as both. Oops, there we go. And so those colors are really hard to see on my screen. They look much better on the handout that I had. But annual ryegrass grows, more in the late season, whereas rye is more in the early season. And so if we put them together, we get a big peak here at the beginning, and then we're going to maintain that peak there at the end of the season. Oops, that's backwards. So we're going to get this peak here at the beginning of the season, same where that rye and the mixture is both growing, and then we'll get that continued growth throughout the end of the season. We just updated the list of recommended varieties on the Georgia Forages page, and if you're interested in more of that data, it's on the statewide variety testing page. There weren't any, big changes this year. There are some that kind of circulated off the recommended list, and most of that is, it's not because the variety did poorly. It was because they didn't submit it for testing within 2 years. So when we're going into or once we know which seed we want to buy, please encourage the producers to buy certified seed and look for that blue tag. That's really important for having a good crop and getting what you're paying for, but also ensuring that we're not having noxious weeds spread onto the farms. So if we're talking about legumes, make sure that they're inoculated. So the population of the rhizobia is likely very low in the soil, especially if legumes haven't been grown there a lot in the past. Most legume seed is going to come pre-inoculated to try to save us that step. But if it's not, we want to use a bag of inoculant per bag of seed. Make sure that it's the correct inoculant for the plant that we're trying to or the seed that we're trying to inoculate. So each type of, or a lot of clovers, they're different from alfalfa, which is different from lespedeza, and we can pull up all that. But we've got to make sure that it's the right rhizobia to go with the right seed. We also need a sticker material, and so that's something usually as simple as sugar water, because the inoculant's going to come in a powder form, and we've got to get it to coat on that seed somehow. So this is one of the most important things that I tell people here kind of at the experiment station is make sure that seed drill is ready before it's time to plant. It never fails. If you wait until the morning before it's time to go plant, to go pull that drill out of the barn, something's going to be clogged or broken. Just something always goes wrong. The big thing that I see is the seed cups and the drop tubes that are kind of down in here. Spiders like to get up in there during the summer when you're not using it, and so we've got to go in and blow all of those out. Same thing with the hoppers. There's the little holes that are in there can get clogged with spiders and other insects, so we got to clean those out. You'd be surprised the number of tools that I find in the tie drills kind of here at the station. Somebody will get done doing a calibration demo or something and just set the wrenches up in the hopper. So we got to make sure everything's out of there before we dump seed in. The big thing there is calibrate. Don't, all the seed drills and every different color of them out there has some sort of table or chart or something on the inside of the hood saying if you set it at 4, it means 20 pounds per acre or something like that. That gets you in the ballpark, but it's not exact. And so we really got to work with the producers on calibrating those drills. Make sure it's set up for the proper drops, especially if you have 2 hoppers like what's in this picture here. There's 2 sets of tubes coming down. And so we got to make sure the right tubes are going to the right disc and so on. And making sure that, we don't have the tubes just flying around under the drill. And then the last one is set the press wheels. A lot of times if we're in really soft soils, we'll just raise those up so we don't push the seed too deep. But if we're in more of a clay type soil, that's going to be really important for pressing that soil back together and ensuring that seed to soil contact. So one of the common questions I get is, what rate do we plant at? And there's a range for each of these. In general, if we grow them by themselves, it's going to be a higher rate than if they're growing in a mixture. We tend to reduce it with the mixture by at least a third. Our small grains are going to be on the highest end, and that's because those seeds weigh a lot more. If you look at kind of a handful of rye seed versus a handful of crimson clover seed, there's a lot more seed in that crimson clover handful than that rye, and that's why we have the difference there. If we're broadcasting, we need to go on the higher end of this range, and if we're drilling, we can go on the lower end. And that's because we're not going to have as good of a result with the broadcast. So something that I've always heard is, good, cheap, or fast, we got to pick 2 of them. So that broadcasting, it may be faster, but it's going to increase the seeding cost because we have to go on the higher end of that range. And it's also likely going to result in lower yields, because we're not going to have as good a seed to soil contact. So we're going to have a lot of seeds that just don't make it into the soil well. They're not pressed down in the soil well. Birds could carry them off. There's just a number of things that can go wrong there. And that seed to soil contact is critical for germination. Now, if we were up, maybe up in North Georgia, like way up in North Georgia, you could probably do what we do, or we've done in Tennessee and Kentucky and places like that, and you can frost seed small seeds like clover, and it works really well. But I would say Atlanta South, we don't get the good freeze thaw cycles that are required for that frost seeding. So if you don't have the soil have a hard freeze, and then when it thaws to really expand and open up, where it's not going to pull that seed down into the soil like it would in a colder location. And so it never fails, even though we talk a lot about calibration, and that includes looking for seed depth. Planting too deep is the #1 cause of planting failures, especially if we're working with something with a small seed, like clovers or alfalfa, or even some of the brassicas that we recommend. So in general, the coulter should be, and so that's the kind of serrated thing up here. We want it to cut about twice the depth of the seed size. So if you think of a small like clover seed or something, that's not very deep. So legumes should be planted no deeper than about 1/4 of an inch, and small grains we can sink them 1/2 to an inch deep, and all that's related to that seed size. It's better to be too shallow than too deep. We could always run a roller or a cultipacker over that field and press those seeds down more. We can't pull them back up once we get them too deep. So I always kind of err on the side of caution and plant shallow instead of deep. If you remember on the tie drill picture, this is a tie drill as well, we had 2 hoppers on there. And so we can plant something like rye or oats or something with the crimson clover at the same time with a drill like that, because it has the 2 hoppers. You can see on here, well, I think there's one right here too. For this particular one, the small hopper was set up with this bigger tube, and then this smaller tube here is coming from the smaller hopper. And so if we were planting those together, we would just pull this small tube out and let it kind of drag here. So that way that clover is planted a lot shallower than whatever small grain's coming out of that bigger tube. So with anything, especially if we're trying to rely on something to grow in the winter, when we're in doubt, we just need to go scout. So proper identification is critical, whether we're talking about weeds that are in there, insects, diseases. We got to know what we're working to try to control. Anything we recommend has to come out of the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. I've had several producers, especially working with the Bermuda grass stem agate, they'll try to get me to recommend something for turf, and we can't do that because it's not recommended in the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. And for each of these, I'm sure y'all have all seen them. It lays it out pretty easily. If you haven't seen it, I should have put the link on here. Patrick McCullough has a new website called GeorgiaPastureWeeds.com, and that's one that I go to a lot because it has all of the different herbicides listed in their labels right there, so it's really easy to navigate. A lot easier than the Pest Management Handbook. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is, for each of these to really maximize the utilization of the stockpile or the crop residue, or to ensure that we have regrowth on a lot of those winter annuals, we need to manipulate that grazing behavior, and that's going to let us extend that winter grazing and better utilize those forages. So I'm not very artistic, as you can tell here, but we have, we're just going to keep these 5 cows throughout the next several slides. All of my fields are perfect rectangles, which of course never happens in real life, but bear with me here. So for a continuous grazing situation, we usually have a water trough up near a gate. There's usually less grass here than down on the end, because the cows are going to want to stay up here where that water and you go in and set the hay bale down. This is what we deal with a lot in Georgia, and so as a result, we usually have pretty poor utilization. If a producer is wanting to stockpile and they just have the one big pasture, it's still possible. What they're going to do is go in to put some sort of temporary wire up, and so that'll keep the cattle off of a certain area and let that grass grow up until we can stockpile it and then move the cattle over there. A better option would be rotational grazing, and so this would be a 4-pasture rotation, and so the cows will just rotate through. This would be a good option for those winter annuals because it's going to allow regrowth, and ideally by the time you get to the end, your first pasture is ready to go again, and you can just restart the cycle. Another take on it is especially if we have a producer kind of starting from scratch and looking at how best to utilize resources. We may recommend that you have one water source there in the middle, especially if this is a really quick rotation. So then they're not having to move that water with them around those pastures. And same concept. They'll rotate around. Just this time, the water's not going to move with them because it's going to be stationary there in the middle. What we do have to watch out for when we have these middle waters, especially in the winter, if it's a little wetter in the winter, we can start getting mud accumulate through here, kind of at that center junction there. So it's just something to watch out for. So frontal grazing is a good option for really making the best use of the stockpile or the crop residue. So instead of feeding a bale of hay every day, we're moving a fence and letting them move up through that field. So we're saying that instead of getting one bale of hay, they're going to get 20 or 30 feet of that field for the day. So it makes the cows really eat down everything instead of patch grazing and eating what they want to. And so they'll just move down the field. So as they graze some, they can head on down. Usually with frontal grazing, we're not moving the water source with them. So we're just, kind of spoon feeding that grass out to them. And that would be another option for a producer that wants to be more continuous instead of more intensive. Now, if we're working on strip grazing, something like the winter annuals, unless we're moving the cattle really quickly across that field, we're strongly going to recommend that they strip graze with a back fence. And so that means that the water has to move with them in that case. And so the cows will go in and graze an area down. You'll move them to the next. So that water's got to go with them because we want what's behind them to slowly start regrowing. So that by the time we get to the end, if they need to, they can go right back there to the beginning. So a grazing system like this requires a lot of work. It does take some effort to get it set up, especially if we don't have a water line with quick connect so we can just move that water along with us. It does take a lot of effort to tank in water in a situation like this. But this is where we're going to see the greatest efficiency of utilizing those winter annuals. So the final thought, because I want to leave time for questions and stuff, winter grazing options only work if there's soil moisture. So I don't know how y'all have been up in North Georgia, but it has been dry for a very long time here in South Georgia. And winter grazing, as great as it is, if we don't have soil moisture to get that seed germinating, it's not going to do us any good. Same thing if we go in and cut hay, right, and put out some fertilizer to stockpile. If it doesn't rain, we're not going to see that forage growth. So, these are all great options, but they are very, very, very weather dependent. And so with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. You guys can turn on your microphone to ask questions if you would. The microphone's easier.
Hey, Lisa, this is Steve.
Hey.
On the slide where you had the mixtures, the graph where you had the mixtures of winter annuals and feeding them alone, ryegrass if I read that slide right, ryegrass generates about 10 to 11,000 pounds of forage per year. And then if you mix that with rye, you get I think I saw you get about 8 to 9. So would you be better just planting straight ryegrass, or is it cheaper to put that rye in there so your cost works out better?
So it depends on what the goal is. If the goal is to just produce as much forage as possible, then we're gonna plant ryegrass only. But if the goal is to have as many grazing days as possible, that's when we need to mix it, because that ryegrass really isn't going to be ready until after Christmas, maybe even up into January. Ryegrass is a lot later than rye. And so with that mixture, the rye is going to jump out of the ground. We can get some grazing, depending on when we get it in the ground, in November and December. And then when that rye is kind of done around Valentine's Day, then that ryegrass is really going to hit its flush, and we'll get more grazing out of that. So one's not necessarily better than the other. It just depends on what the goal is.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Lisa? All right, nothing in the chat box. So I will assume that's all the questions, but you all know where to find her if you have questions, and she's happy to take your calls, at least her emails. Thanks, Lisa, so much for joining us today for ANR Hour. If you want to mark your calendars, the next one will be related. Actually, on September 13th at 10 a.m., Jason will be opportunities for beef producers. So mark your calendars now, and it's the same link always. So you can file it away and use it, but we'll send it out, and your PDCs will send it out. So thank you everyone for joining us. Lisa, we had 21 agents online, so that was a great number, and we will archive it. So everyone can look through the archives, and I will send it to you too, Lisa.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank y'all. Have a great week.